Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello, could I please speak with Carolin Emcke?
That's me. You're talking to me. Hi, dear.
I am talking to you.
Yes.
That's,
Hi, Paul.
Hello, Carolin. Carolin Emcke, I'm so happy that you're part of the Quarantine Tapes. I really felt we absolutely needed an articulate voice from Europe during these.
Thanks for having me, Paul. I'm quite honored. Thanks very, very much.
Well, I'm very, very pleased, and as I said, I really feel that we need an articulate voice from Europe. We've had a few, but this pandemic really is it's exactly pan. It's everywhere around the world, and there isn't just one virus, but several viruses, and I want to talk to you about them. You've written about them. You've written 3 splendid books, which I encourage all of our listeners to read. Against Hate is one of them. Echoes of Violence is another one, and one that I particularly love called How We Desire. Tell me, Carolin, where do I find you at the moment, and how have you been spending these last, let us say, 4 months?
I'm sitting in Berlin in the neighborhood of Kreuzberg, and I've basically spent the last couple of months, immobile, so to speak, in lockdown modus. But one has to say, in Berlin, it was an extremely, I would say, privileged situation because the lockdown was not as harsh as it was in other European countries. We were still able to go out and run, for example. You could still do sports in the park. You were also allowed to go out not just with a partner that you're living with in the same household, but also with one other person. I think it was a much more liberal situation, and yet evidently, even if you are based in Berlin, I guess that's for you quite similar. You do think about all the other friends you have elsewhere. You do think about all the other places that I've traveled to, and so it's been a haunting situation, I would say.
Tell me, why? First of all, do you think the more relaxed situation in Berlin was a judicious way of operating? And how do you explain that perhaps things in Berlin are better than elsewhere?
It's a very good question. I mean, I would say that even though we also have had, the ideology of privatization, the ideology of, an economic dogma within the health system, but I don't think it has been as successful yet or as subversive. It hasn't totally neoliberalized the health system, as in, I would say, Britain, for example, or right. Spain or Italy. So I think first of all, simply the sheer numbers of intensive care units, also actually the fact of the federal system pretty intact to the extent that there is really a widespread medical system, even on the countryside. Evidently not as good as in the urban areas, but I don't think it's such a centralized country as maybe France, to take another example. And I think that tremendously helped, that people could go and see a doctor from early on, that they were treated prior to that stage when people would already have to go into the intensive care unit.
Right.
So I think that was helpful. One should also say that the fact that in Spain and in Italy, the public health system wasn't as well equipped isn't just their fault, but it's also a fault of, a European policy that was dominated by the German understanding of austerity. And so, it's a very ambiguous situation to feel on one hand lucky to be here in Germany, to feel privileged that, we somehow managed to get through that crisis until now, reasonably well. But at the same time feel guilty about the conditions in the southern parts of Europe, because they are, in part at least, an effect of, a European debt strategy, a European austerity strategy that was very much dictated, but it was dominated by German understanding of austerity. So
you use the word guilt. And feeling guilty has been something that maybe Germans confronted in one form or another for a very long time. And many Americans tend to think that Germany has confronted its history in a way that is productive. I remember a conversation you and I had about Brian Stevenson and his work and the ways in which he really thought that America had not confronted its problems of lynching and racism. And I think this fact has been heightened now in the last months. Now, do you share that view that Germany has in fact confronted its history in a productive way, and in what way do you think it has or hasn't?
Well, evidently, I would feel uncomfortable in, creating a hierarchy of how well has, a society dealt with its violent past. So I would not want to suggest, that Germany has learned its lessons better than the US. I mean, I'm not in a position to say that. Evidently, we can talk about the racism, the structural and institutional racism in the US. But if you ask me about Germany, I would say the memorial culture that I would say indeed exists in Germany. And in particular, for my generation, I'm born in 1967, for my generation, the entire political and moral socialization as a citizen, but also as a political being, had as a reference point the Shoah, had as a reference point Auschwitz, had as a reference point the reflection on the historic responsibility for the crimes, the National Socialist regime and its citizens committed. But then one also has to be honest enough to say that the re-education policy after the war wasn't something that the German society created all by themselves, but it was something that was demanded by the Allies, and so it wasn't choice. It wasn't a real choice or a democratic decision-making process, but it was something that was demanded. And then I would say in '68, with the student movement, with the protest movement, there was sort of a second wave of politicization and really, really a serious discussion and I think recognition of the crimes committed. And so that that history, I think, has really inscribed itself into the canon of the schools, but also into the public discourse. But then the colonial history is much less discussed, much less recognized. Germans tend to think, well, there wasn't really such a long colonial period for Germans in comparison to Belgian or French history. And I think we should also be honest. In recent years, we've also seen a right radical movement, a right radical party, even in parliament now. So I think one should never think that you're immune to these racist, anti-Semitic ideologies. There is this dogma,
or that it's over.
Exactly.
Of course, le travail n'est jamais fait. The work is never over. It's always in progress. But what is interesting in what you're saying is it was demanded, but then it was pursued. And I'm wondering whether this moment and all these protests will lead this country, namely the United States, to be under the same kind of scrutiny. And I think you might have your doubts. But before we even answer that question, or perhaps touch upon it in a moment, I want to get to something you've written about. You've written about Eric Garner, and I'd like for you to share some of that writing with our audience. And then, how has the uprising of around George Floyd been perceived in Germany, and why do you think it triggered these kinds of international protests? I know it's a lot to ask you for.
Fine.
But it's all connected.
I'm very, very glad you gave me the opportunity, Paul, so thanks very, very much. And indeed, I wrote an entire chapter on Eric Garner in the book that you mentioned earlier called Against Hate, which was published in 2016. The Eric Garner killing took place in 2014, and I have to admit this was now. I mean, the killing of George Floyd was unbearable. I mean, unbearable for itself, but also because he repeated the same "I can't breathe" that Eric Garner had already uttered in 2014, and I felt it had become at the time in 2014 a code of trauma, but a trauma not in the sense of something in the past, but a trauma that is still alive in the present and gets permanently triggered by the police violence as now. And so it meant I don't know, it's been I think for everyone in the US, but also for me sitting here in Berlin, incredibly painful days and hopeful days. What I would like to read though is not the passage on Eric Garner himself, but something that matters to me a little bit more, namely a reference to the poet Claudia Rankine, whom I admire a lot, and you will see why I will read that passage when I read it. The poet Claudia Rankine also tells about the experience of invisibility in her most recent book, Citizen. A black boy is knocked down in the subway by a man who did not see him. The man keeps going, doesn't help the boy up, doesn't apologize, as if no contact had occurred, as if no person had been in his path. Rankine writes, and I quote, "And you wanted to stop. You want the child pushed to the ground to be seen, to be helped to his feet, to be brushed off by the person that did not see him, has never seen him, has perhaps never seen anyone who's not a reflection of himself." End of quote. You wanted to stop. You want not just some people to be visible, not just those who reflect some image that someone invented and declared to be the norm. You want just being a person to be enough. No other qualities or characteristics to be required for a person to be seen. You don't want the people who look a little different from the norm to be overlooked. You don't want there to be a norm at all for what is visible and what is invisible. You don't want people who deviate from the norm to be knocked down because they have a different skin color or different body, because they love differently or believe differently or hope differently from the majority whose image sets the norm. That's from Against Hate. And if I may add one sentence to this, I have to admit I'm appalled by the fact that a man needs to be killed in daylight, filmed on video, for us to react. Whereas the example of Claudia Rankine is, I think this is where we still have to go. I don't want that only to be, a political movement to transform the American police violence. But we want people to be seen. We don't want a boy to be pushed down in the subway and nobody even notices that there has been the contact. So what I'm a little bit worried about is that our standards for what we find unacceptable are so bloody low. Sorry if I might.
No.
But you understand what I mean?
Of course I do, and the fact that maybe the difference now, if one wants to be slightly cynical, is that things are simply filmed.
Yeah, that's true. And I have to say, in both cases, the Eric Garner video that exists and the George Floyd video that exists, what is extremely impressive in both cases, and I think that's what makes it, bearable is the wrong term here, but why you can watch it at all is that people are interfering, they're intervening, they're telling the police, don't do this. So there's a different voice, there's a different perspective, there's a witness. As you know, I've worked a lot on witnessing, and
yes.
I think it's key to have these videos with the voice that's a humanist voice, a voice that does not accept what is to be seen, because otherwise it would only be voyeuristic and unacceptable.
I can understand how you were prefacing what you were about to read by saying that it was unbearable. Hearing you read wasn't unbearable, but it's very traumatic, and truly traumatic in the sense that it's an open wound, really an open wound. You have argued, Carolin, that hatred is in fact created. It is used as a tool. How do you think that is playing out now in the midst of these, what one might call these several crises?
I think it's very important that sometimes in the discussion of hate crimes or of racial violence or violence against migrants in Europe or against refugees, there is an attempt to normalize the hatred and to somehow treat it as if it were just, an anthropological given, as if it was just, a spontaneous outbreak of emotion against, somebody Jewish or, a refugee or a black body. And they really resist that narrative. It's not natural and it's not individual. It's something that is formed. It's it's a regime of a gaze that is produced, and it's collectively produced. It's channeled. It's the construction of an other that is either demonized or dehumanized, so that you can channel the hatred against that object. And I think it is important to think and speak about hatred that way in order to make sure that we do not only respond to violent outbreaks on the street or violent crime on the street, but that we're also really careful about those people who make money with,
who exploit the
producing,
and who exploit the crisis.
Yeah, I mean, they don't even have to hate themselves; they let others
do it.
Yeah, and they make money with it in their published houses or on their radio talk shows or, within the party system. And so I think there's a real danger in sort of individualizing or somewhat naturalizing hatred as if it wasn't something that was ideologically produced.
Which leads me to ask you, the crisis, like any major crisis, really is being exploited by powerful people. Who in Europe is exploiting this situation, do you think, to amass more power? And then do you think that by the end of this we'll be closer to a totalitarian system of control? And I'm thinking particularly...
I think the pandemic is... an invitation for authoritarianism. I think it is something that can be easily exploited by, governments or political regimes.
How so?
Well, you can see in Hungary, for example, Viktor Orban, who has had a liberal record, to put it mildly, already, who's basically declared a state of exception that doesn't even need, basically he doesn't need the opposition anymore. He doesn't need parliament anymore. And so I think there's a real danger of authoritarian regimes using the pandemic as a pretext for
surveillance,
excluding
surveillance.
Yes, for surveillance that is one, but I think also for again, channeling in this case not maybe hatred in the first place, but guilt. You could see in Bulgaria, in Romania, immediately the archaic old dynamic of suggesting this was the fault of the Roma. It's the old. I mean, it's like the Jews poisoned. I mean, no, it's the old scapegoating mechanism that we could see, evolve, and yet. I think we could also see, also in the US, but here in Europe also, you could see what I would call, or Leo Löwenthal once called, false prophets.
Yes, and I'd love you to I know you've written about Leo Löwenthal's false prophets, but who are you thinking about who are you thinking are the false prophets at this particular
I think at the moment, when you see, at the moment you have in Europe, but I think also in the US, maybe at the moment not that visible, but you have these groups and protests, movements against the corona legislations or the restrictions or the lockdown. And it was here in Europe a really bizarre mix of people. You had anti-vaccine sort of hippies. You had Bill Gates, conspiracy theorists, and you had the right radical movement instrumentalize and use the insecurity, the disorientation, and the fear. I mean, the real fear of the people, and use it for their own agenda. And I think that is a real thing.
So
I'm not so...
As you mentioned, as you know, and sorry myself, but as you mentioned Leo Lowenthal and false prophets, I know for you, as well as for me, I might say, the Frankfurt School matters greatly, the importance of their analysis. How has it, do you think, informed the way you look at this present moment?
The Frankfurt School has influenced the way I look at everything. I'm afraid. So I think I just can't get that out of my entire system. No, but I think the Frankfurt School, both Adorno and Horkheimer, and Marcuse and Leo Lowenthal, had a whole spectrum of studies and essays on authoritarianism.
Yes.
Last year, there was the publication of the text from Adorno on new aspects of right radicalism, which is, imagine that to be published in the year 2019. And it's still incredibly useful as an instrument to analyze the current situation. And Leo Lowenthal, as you might know, the False Prophets text is from 1949, and he studied right populists in the US, and the phenomenon of populism. And if you read it now, you can apply it. Not in everything, evidently. I mean, it's also an historic text, and it's a very particular context. But yet there are some systematic arguments about agitation that are really helpful for analyzing the moment.
Caroline, in closing, sadly, might I say, there's a quotation of Max Horkheimer I really like, and I'd like you to respond to it, thinking about the present moment, maybe thinking about the present moment as perhaps, as Arundhati Roy has said, as a portal. He says, "I do not believe that things will turn out well, but the idea that they might is of decisive importance."
Yeah, I don't even think one should ask oneself that question. I think evidently we have to create a universal we, a humanist we, despite the fact that it's denied and negated and subverted and ignored every day, everywhere in the world. And I think by speaking and by writing and by a conversation like this one, of course, we and by making references to writers in the past or in the present, we are trying to create such a humanist conversation,
a space, and a dialogue.
Exactly, and I think I don't want to think it will be effective or if it will be powerful, but I just couldn't live without it.
It's what we're doing now and what we need to do now. What you and I know how to do at this present moment. And Caroline, the only enemy here at this present moment between you and me is time. I had so many things to talk to you about. I wanted to talk to you about desire. I also wanted to talk to you, quite frankly, about the work you're doing, perhaps you're continuing to do on prisons and people who are on death row in the US. But we will leave this. Yes. We will leave this for another time. And in the meantime,
I'd love to, Paul. Thanks very, very much for having me.
And we'll speak some more soon. Take care of yourself. I can't wait until I see you.
You too.
Thank you so much. Take good care.
Thanks very, very much, Paul.
Thank you,
Bye.
Caroline. Bye-bye.
Bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.